to see everybody here. My name is Sim Kapoor, and I have the privilege of serving as OASI's Director of Advancement Communications and External Relations. And before we begin, we wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and it is our pleasure and privilege to work on this land. Before we begin now, I would like to introduce our dynamic and visionary leader, Dean Erica Walker. Please join me in welcoming Dean Walker to the stage.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Sam. I see so many wonderful folks in the audiences. It's great to see all of you. On behalf of the Ontario Institute for Studies and Education and the Dr. Eric Jackman Institute of Child Study, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this truly special celebration. This is an evening where we honor literary excellence while marking the remarkable centennial legacy of the Dr. Eric Jackman Institute of Child Study. Tonight represents something truly extraordinary. We are celebrating 100 years of the Jackman Institute, transforming lives and shaping futures, one child, one family, and one groundbreaking discovery at a time. This gathering weaves together a century of wisdom with tomorrow's possibilities, blending scholarship with boundless imagination and connecting hearts and minds across generations, embodying the very essence of what Boise and the Jackman Institute represent. We are especially delighted that tonight's event coincides with the University of Toronto's alumni reunion, bringing together more than 170 guests with us both in person and online. Your presence here, our alumni and friends, whether across the room or across the country, makes the celebration complete. And how fitting it is that we're hosting this evening in one of my favorite spaces on campus and one of the most treasured spaces by all of us, the Boise Library, which is proudly recognized as Canada's premier educational library. This space happens to embody our deepest values. It's a sanctuary for learning, reflection, and discovery, making it the perfect setting for tonight's celebration of storytelling and scholarship. Tonight also marks a highlight of Boise's Writers' Roost series, and we are absolutely thrilled to feature one of Toronto's most compelling literary voices, New York Times bestselling author Emma Knight, and Conversation with Author Emma Knight. Dr. Jeff Myers is our alum, and he's also the acting Assistant Vice President of Enrollment and University Registrar at Dalhousie University. Emma's latest novel, The Life Cycle of the Common Octopus, is a stunning achievement, witty, atmospheric, and deeply moving. It explores the intricacies of womanhood, motherhood, and friendship through the lens of an extraordinary British family. We are so honored to welcome Emma and to celebrate her work with our community this evening. My heartfelt gratitude goes to Dr. Jeff Myers, who has traveled all the way from Halifax to be with us tonight. Jeff, your willingness to make this journey speaks volumes, and your presence enriches this evening immeasurably. Thank you so much for hosting and bringing this extraordinary. All right. Evenings like this remind us of why we do what we do at Boise. These kinds of events illuminate the transformative power of story, dialogue, and human connection. So thank you so much to all of you for joining us tonight, for being part of this remarkable Boise community. And now it's my great pleasure to invite Harry King to the stage to introduce our distinguished guest. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everybody. I have the esteemed privilege to introduce our guests, so bear with me as they bio First and foremost, Emma Knight is a Canadian writer. She is also the co-founder of Greenhouse, an award-winning organic beverage company based in Toronto. Her first novel, The Life Cycle of the Common Octopus, was a number one national bestseller in America, not in Canada, and a New York Times bestseller. She has authored two nationally best-selling cookbooks, The Greenhouse Cookbook and How to Eat with One Hand. Actually curious about how to do that. And her essays appeared in the Globe and Mail, The Walrus, British Vogue, and Literary Hub. And has studied modern European languages at the University of Edinburgh, and journalism and international affairs at Sciences Po in Paris. Emma is being joined on stage with one of my favorite people. Dr. Jackman is the proud graduate of voice. He earned his master's in 2007. I don't want to age you, but that's what's going to happen. He also earned his PhD here in 2013, and he's an active member of the Boise Alumni Association. He currently holds the position of acting assistant vice president in enrollment and university registrar at LSE University in Halifax, one of my favorite cities in the world. His long-standing interest in intercultural learning led to an early career in international education, which has since encompassed roles in teaching, curriculum development, program management, and academic leadership. Dr. Myers is deeply committed to the transformative potential of education across all stages of learning. So, without further ado, a round of applause for our guest.
This is so exciting.
Nice to see you off from podcast.
Yeah. She said, how did you get your best setting ops? Not actually true, but this book is, I was having a show of hands who's actually had a chance to read the book. Oh, that's pretty good representation. But the first thing you'll notice when you pick up this book, if you haven't done so already, is just like how beautiful it is. So that was actually my first question. I talked to you about it upstairs, but can you, so this is unusual in an author talk to start with the artist who made the cover, but could you tell me about that?
When I first saw this cover, my thought was, please judge my book. I think the publishers did a wonderful job. So they actually asked me if I had any input, which I wasn't expecting, and one does not expect that with one's first novel. And because I have a bit of a marketing background with Greenhouse, and I tend to be a little bit of a hair splitter in general, I sent them a 5-page deck with 3 different directions. And to my astonishment, they managed to integrate some of those ideas. But this is a painting that existed already that they found by Captain Nolan, a wonderful visual artist painter based in Massachusetts. And it's called Gabriella's Table. I wasn't able to buy the original because it had already sold, but I don't know, here it has it. And I love how the subtle tentacles and flowers, the portrait that may or may not be the protagonist, and I just think it's funny, oceanic background works.
That's the value of that thing we just put up by the cost. So it's a beautiful book outside, it's also a beautiful book inside, it's a really beautiful story, and it actually has a really beautiful title, I think, and I'm sure, I know you get asked about this all the time, and if you've heard the title, you're probably curious about it, so The Life Cycle of the Common Octopus, tell us about what you can tell us about, because the true meaning behind that comes later in the book, and so you don't want to spoil the plot, obviously.
Okay, well, it is not a book about octopuses. And I understand, I haven't looked, but my husband, who's in the room tonight, has told me that there are a few disgruntled people on the series as a result of this. Which is totally understandable because the octopus is a fascinating creature. It is a metaphor for a vision of motherhood that might sometimes be a bit of a Loch Ness monster, something that we, big up in our minds as this scary, dangerous creature that if we're, I suppose, okay, I'll tell you that the life cycle of the octopus and not just the common octopus, but all kinds of octopuses, spend, especially the female octopus, spends a huge proportion of her life caring for her young. And she cleans her eggs, she takes care of them, she dedicates herself entirely to this cause to the point that she stops going out to look for food. And her body starts to waste away and she enters something called senescence. And sometimes, this is particularly grim, but sometimes when the hatchlings are first born, her decomposing corpse forms part of their first.
None of this is in the book.
In the book, there is, I was writing this book at the beginning of my own motherhood journey. And the expectation of self-sacrifice is sort of what I was alluding to with my long-winded Loch Ness Monster tangent. And the characters in this novel are in different ways wrapped into that.
In the acknowledgements, you say somebody saved you from a much more mundane title, and so I'm really curious what the more mundane, I don't know if your agent's here and you're allowed to say it or not.
I don't think Samuel's because her mom's book is coming out tonight, in the neighborhood actually, so there were so many mundane titles. I don't think I can tell you, you know, always expect me, but there was some poor titles. And this was low down on the list because I thought it was too unwieldy and too cryptic and that it would never work. But when she saw my list, she said, that's your title.
Yeah, and you nailed it.
Yes.
So it's a deeply personal book for you, I take it from your story just now, like the theme of motherhood is so important to the overall book. Can you tell me a little bit about the overall plot and how motherhood features into the plot?
Sure, so it's actually about an 18-year-old protagonist called Penelope Winters, and she is a bit of a late bloomer. She's from Toronto. She lives more in her head than in her body. She's someone who is really driven by curiosity, and her parents are divorced. There's something in that history that she's aware of not knowing. And she feels this lack of knowledge like a stone in her shoe. And she becomes quite obsessed with figuring out what happened earlier in their lives. So she moves to Scotland to attend the University of Edinburgh in part, but also to track down an estranged friend of the father's, who's now a well-known novelist by the name of Lord Lennox. And much to her surprise, he answers her unsolicited letter and invites her to spend the weekend at his family's centuries-old estate on the east coast of Scotland. And she enters this enveloping world of charming, baffling people who will do just about anything to make her feel comfortable, except for answering her direct questions. And over a series of visits to this estate where she falls in love with not only Lord Lennox, but his charming wife Christina and his aunt Sasha, and she gets to know this family, she continues to pull at the thread of that family secret and ends up unraveling more than she bargained for.
It's such a good story because it's a mystery, right? It was a mystery novel on some level too. I don't know about you, but whenever I'm reading a novel, I can't help but think about like what Hollywood actors would play in the film version of it. And like it's a little too on the nose, but I had like that woman who plays Emily in Paris in mind for Penelope. So, but the genuine question in there is, if you had some, Hollywood actors might be really curious who winds up with who, but do you think it would ever adapt to a screenplay or like a miniseries or would the story have to change when it did that?
It's so old.
It has been marketed, it has been optioned. Yes, it's like. Yes, so MGM, which is now owned by Amazon, auctioned it, and they have a production company that they're working with called Stable Artists, and they've already attached the showrunner and the pilot apparently, so who knows? These things take a long time, of course, but it does seem that some wheels are in motion. It would be a series, which means that the plot would continue.
Oh, interesting.
Yes.
So have you given some thought about that, where it goes next?
Some thought, if that were to really happen, then I would be involved.
Right.
So that would be fun. Well, that's not always the case. But I did want some involvement, so should that happen, should the series really go to camera, post-pilot and everything, then I will have some involvement in what becomes these characters after the last stage of the novel.
So, like I said, deeply personal, I know there are friends of yours here in the audience, your husband is here, and you went to the University of Edinburgh, so clearly some of the storyline comes from your own personal experience, like how much of this was life imitating art, and where were the lines blurred, so.
So when I started writing this, it had been 10 years since I had set foot in Scotland. And in some ways that was perfect because my memories of the city of Edinburgh were completely intact. Sometimes you're walking the same streets for years afterwards, you create new memories and you can kind of override the old memories. But in my case, it was as if the Edinburgh that I had walked as an 18, 19-year-old, 20-year-old was still fully present, intact in my memory. And it surprised me because it's not as if I've been walking the streets every day for those 10 years, not at all. But the first person who came to me, character, was the character of Fergus, Scarlet Moore. And he just sort of strode into my brain one day. And I was in Algonquin Park with a small child. And it made no sense whatsoever that this kind of lanky British man in sand-colored pants who refuses to wear a coat in any kind of weather and, has a very kind of juvenile, this sort of sad clown sense of humor should be walking into my brain. But he did, and he started talking. And he was heckling another character called Ken. I kind of thought, no, her name can't be Ken, because she was already starting to form in my brain, and I thought that's way too on the nose. She can't be called Pen if she wants to be a journalist. But she was called Pen, and there was no altering that fact. So they just started talking to each other. And I figured, okay, well, so either, this is, I've gone around that completely, or this is the beginning of something. In either case, I'm gonna write this down. And so I just wrote down bits of dialogue, and it sort of came from there.
We were talking a little bit about upstairs about how those characters, like you are in their heads, they're in your head all of the time, and then you write it all down, and then the rest of us read the book and we have our opinions about them, but those characters continue to live in your head. So is there like a gulf, like an increasing gulf between what the reader thinks about these people and how they've evolved in your own mind?
Yes, I was telling you upstairs that occasionally in kind of a book club style conversation, I'll find myself getting incredibly defensive about one of the characters. And they don't all behave in perfectly moral ways at all times, but who does? And to me, they're real, and there's always a reason. So, and I was saying earlier that one of the things that surprised me, this is my first novel, and I didn't know that in order to write one novel, you actually have to write several novels, to not write several novels, because, the moments that you choose in a character's life to show are, of course, what you include, but there are so many other parts of your life that you're not including that you still need to, of course, know. And I suppose to your previous question about life and art, because the settings are in some cases borrowed from life, and because the time period is the same time period when I was university, and I was very intentional. 2006 happened right before the iPhone. So I couldn't alter the time period because what an interesting kind of cultural moment, the last era of students who were not living like this. And so I decided to keep it in the same time period. I didn't want to change the city because Edinburgh is a character. And Edinburgh is also famously a city with ghosts. And this is a story about ghosts. A story about the unlived lives of our parents, a story about the kind of inheritance that we carry with us that we don't always understand from previous generations, and one young woman's quest to understand as much of it as possible to move forward as herself. So I didn't want to set it elsewhere. And in order to keep the Fergus of my brain straight from the three separate Ferguses I went to university with, for example. And I had to be very disciplined about building out a full story world that exists in parallel, I guess, with my own memories at that time.
Kind of sounds like method acting, like where you kind of have to understand the full character in order to write the few words in another
It is a
book,
little
right?
bit like method acting, yes. And I think in moments of being stuck, I definitely borrow techniques from, kind of training habits and
And you answered another question of mine, which was whether the time period was specific, because technology is on display in the novel. Like you go from sort of Penn's parents using journals and letters and using what I imagined was a flip phone, may not have been, but the text messages,
Yeah.
early IMs and stuff, but before
Yeah.
the full advent of Facebook and video chats and all those sorts of things. So that was a conscious decision.
That was a conscious decision, because there is a kind of participatory element to this novel, the love story that takes place in it, but I don't think there's anything great to say that it sort of starts with instant messages and text messages, and yes, the idea that there was that form of communication, but people weren't glued to it yet in a way that now, there wasn't an expectation of instantaneous response unless we were both online simultaneously. It was a different era of connectivity. And I also think that the loneliness that these characters experience is so formative. And that type of loneliness it doesn't really exist in the same way now. That loneliness of nobody knows where I am right now. I'm not in touch with anybody at this moment here.
Yeah.
This was a time before you were constantly checking up on your loved ones you knew, from social media, from texts, exactly, whether they were online at that moment, what was going on. This was the time when you could really just, and sometimes had to, sit with your loneliness and not that of course there's a different kind of loneliness that's born of this hyper connection. And I don't want to discount that side as possibly worse. But I think she confronts kind of a loneliness in this book, kind of that's anyway, that has changed.
So maybe with the second chapter. Anyway, this is a really good segue to my next question, which is the kind of one of the arcs of the book is that she's solving this mystery in her parents' life, and I think that that's kind of core to the human existence on some level. Like we all grow up with a fuzzy understanding of what happened when you were born or what came to that time in the world. So tell me a little bit about that theme of like resolving the mysteries of your parents, almost as a rite of passage, and how it may have changed. Yeah, things like DNA testing or digital photographs, etc.
As I was writing, I became very interested in this Jungian notion of individuation, which is the process by which we become ourselves as separate individuals on our own path, with our own unique worldview and contribution. And I think the process of achieving that is lifelong. And it's funny when people ask what genre is this novel, I sometimes say coming of age because it is technically a coming of age novel, but it's sort of two parallel coming of age novels because it's bookended by 31-year-old Penn who has just become a mother. She's coming of age in that way, which is a very intense form of coming of age. And she's writing about her 18-year-old self who was leaving home physically for the first time. And trying to delve into this past life of her parents, recognizing the way you sort of do as you're entering that period. Oh, my parents had full lives. I was even born. Gosh, what did they get to? So she was answering that question, at her peril, as we all answer that question at our peril. And her kind of more grown-up self is looking back with some tenderness and some kind of dramatic irony and at the younger version of her. And so I think that we are hopefully all coming of age all the time. And that's sort of what individuation is. We're gathering facts, we're building this sense of self, we're knowing ourselves in our environment, hopefully better all the time. And so that's the mission that she's on. And as she becomes a mother, it's a kind of continuation of that same process.
So you're a mom. I think your kids may even be here this evening. I'm not sure if they're in the room or not, but I'm so curious how exploring that theme in a novel form has affected your own approach to parenting. And like whether you are intentionally or unintentionally leaving mysteries for your own children. So it's like 20 years.
Well, the digital footprint really will cause problems there. So it's interesting that you asked that. The kind of courage to write a novel did come from my eldest daughter as watching me work during pandemic. She was just learning to talk and we were stuck at home, of course, all the time. There were a lot of doors or walls in our house. And so she was constantly sort of sitting there watching me, like, what are you doing? I'm working. She'd say, what's your word? And I found myself like being witnessed in my professional life by the person who I most want to model for, all the time. And I was pregnant with her little sister, and greenhouse was what I was doing. We were, Anthony, my husband, and I together, with a third partner, Hannah, program the greenhouse, and at that point, we were 8 years in, and the pandemic was really hard on us, as it is for all, as it was for a lot of businesses, of course. And it was kind of an existential moment, and the intensity with which I was working and being witnessed at that work, was something. And then as we started asking questions like, what kind of work should I do? And that really gave me pause. I didn't want to answer her with just some quick sort of, whatever we love. I didn't want to be too hasty about it. So I gave the questions some thought. And eventually I came to, you should do something that makes you feel like yourself and something that you'll always want to get better at. And I can see as I'm poking through the back, she's shared. And there she is, like I conjured her. And she sort of listened to that, and I listened to it too, and I thought that's not at all what I'm doing. I love our business and I'm so proud of it, but I'm not doing the thing that I really need to do. And she will feel that, because kids feel everything, and I kind of figured I have approximately 4 months to change course before she starts telling her that. And at that point, the kind of Ferguson walked in, and I've always written, there have always been notebooks filled with beginnings and scraps, and it was sort of the moment when I realized, okay, I need to take this more seriously, because she'll feel it whether I try or not.
Another really powerful theme in this book is friendship, and I'm going to read a very short passage, page 312, that it really struck me personally. She and Penn had been friends since well before they had discovered the need to construct an outer shell, like that of an invertebrate animal, to protect the soft inner substance of the cell. Childhood friendships often lose their hold at that point, when one sees that the person one loved has learned to disguise herself and will no longer be reachable, or at least not often. What made Alice feel certain, as Penn helped herself to the roll of toilet paper on the desk, she's like cleaning lice out of her hair, I think, wipe her nose, that this friendship could take them through every stage of their lives, pushing them against the bone-crushing loneliness of being human, was that they did not have to pretend to each other. Silently, she vowed to remember this. I introduced you to my best friend Elizabeth, who's here in the audience on the way in, so I'm going to actually get you to dedicate this book to her when you sign it later, if she wants to read it. So, but just tell me a little bit about the theme of friendship in this book.
So I think the friendship between Penn and Alice is the central love story of this text. There is another love story, but to me, the central love story is one of two very close friends who are actually helping one another grow and change. And I think so many of us do lose those central friendships in moments of transition, because it's hard to kind of build a bridge that takes you through that, to get past these changes that we're all supposed to change. Like actually constantly coming of age points, hopefully we are evolving all the time. But you hear in friendship conversations all the time, you've changed, you're not who I thought you're not who you used to be. And I think what's unique about Penn is that they have wound up in the same place through university, and they've been friends for a very long time, and they recognize the danger of that. Like they actually are worried that if they remain too fused in this new context, and they'll hold each other back from the change, and it's the change they've come for. So they allow each other, and it's painful, and sometimes they're not so kind to one another in this process, that they allow each other over the course of the book to make mistakes and to grow and to come into themselves. And the witnessing of that and kind of the tenderness in which they both treat that ultimately, and the way they come back to each other, for me, is a love story. And I think we sometimes in literature, film, don't give a sense of position to the love stories that really, really carry us through our lives.
Yeah, I think, there are lots of moments in the book, but there was one moment where they've had a little bit of a falling out, and then something horrible happens to Alice, and then Penn just sort of goes running to protect her, and I don't know what those of you who read it, I certainly like teared up at that point of the book for sure. Let's talk a little bit about, the university experience, because and not to make this about me, but there are lots of parallels to my life. I went to UT, I actually finished reading the book on UT campus after I read the reference to Hard House. I went and sat in front of Hard House and read it. I moved to New Scotland, I go, work at Dalhousie, etc. So some parallels, but the university experience is a plot device. And while there are some scenes that happen in classrooms and Penn's devotion to literature, philosophy, and so on, there's a sense in which the university experience is more about the friendships that happens in the pubs and the dorm rooms and so on. So I wanted you to comment on that. What do you think is the balance in the undergraduate, I suppose, in particular, university experience of those things, like social part of the experience versus the academic experience? And maybe, how that showed up for you in Edinburgh and how it shows up in the book.
Well, first of all, I can tell you that the philosophy lectures, and there are cut scenes in tutorials and lectures, that they all come from, those come from my very detailed notes in introduction to philosophy.
Good.
The academic portion of my own university experience did stay with me, but I do think that the growth and development of being away from home and having to, even if it is in a relatively protected environment, which some university campus experiences can be, depending on one's circumstances, but having to kind of figure out certain things for oneself for the first time, all of that growth and development can be as important as what you learn about the great philosophers. And I think that in the case of these characters, and particularly Penn, she's gone as far away from home as possible on purpose, not only to solve this mystery, but also to put herself in a completely different situation, see how she handles it, and to kind of experience that independence for the first time, or that even if it is kind of a child limited independence. And I think that's one of the most valuable and precious gifts that any young person can have. And I think it wouldn't make sense with if you weren't also working toward a career that will then enable you hopefully to remain important, and learning all kinds of things that will enrich your life and your understanding of the world. But I think that the relationships and the kind of self-discovery aspect is, so Bildungsroman, I don't speak German, but I Googled Bildungsroman at one point and learned that I wanted to know what the origin of the word was, and it's novel of education, it's not coming of age directly, it's novel of education. And I thought, that's what this is, because yes, it takes place at a university, but it's really also, she's educating herself about who she is and who she wants to become.
It makes it a very relatable book, because even though it's about a young person predominantly, like people at any age will relate to, I think, to the characters in this book. We've all gone through those sorts of experiences. I mean, maybe not if you're the children's age just yet. All right, I have two more questions, and then we're going to take a couple of questions from the audience. The penultimate question is: you're such a good writer, it's not actually believable that this is your first novel, but your other writing is journalistic in form or short form writing for magazines and so on. So what was the experience of writing a novel like compared to those other types of writing?
More free. Fiction is so much fun in that letting your imagination roam is one of the most joyful experiences. I love seeing my husband doing that. So definitely more free, but also more mind bending, because I found myself structurally it's hard to mix, it's hard to hold the whole thing in your mind, while also holding your mind all the parts that you're leaving out, and what it is that you're actually trying to say. I found the kind of big picture, small picture interplay challenging, and I'm finding it challenging with what I'm working on now. So something you'll always want to get better at box is definitely being ticked, because I'm finding it's a lot of fun and it's immensely challenging.
How do you practically do that? Do you have like mind maps? Do you have like loads of notes and different drafts?
So.
We don't give away all the treats.
No, just that at 6 o'clock this morning, I was sitting at the Jackman with Esme and Frida, and we had paper and crayons out, and we're like, what are you writing? And I was trying to solve some problems in the current narrative. And, you know, we were all working together, and they were reading out, I think, reading, was reading aloud, and my questions that, you know, yes, tons of line ups, timelines, but also just kind of problem solving visually sometimes, other times on the fly.
Keep giving me really good segues. So this book has been a major success. As we heard, it was a New York Times bestseller, national bestseller. You've done interviews in lots of places, including with one of my heroes, Potato Roach. So readers like me and everywhere want to know what's next. What can you tell us about that thing that you were?
The document.
Document.
So there is a document, and what can I tell you about the document? The document is perhaps slightly darker than this document, and it touches on similar themes. It takes place in North America, largely this time, and it is in part about what happens when someone varies their want, tries to live in a way that negates the want that in other parts, you know, that can really compel you as a being negating one, of course. And there's this character who, okay, she's a mother, you already guessed it. is really trying hard to suppress that and the consequences thereof.
Are there any metaphorical sea creatures?
No metaphorical sea creatures thus far, but I can't promise that. I really can't.
Are there any questions from the audience? I think Perry said a microphone is going to break.
We bring plus for best of this. These are we going to do. I don't want to remember so much again. Okay. So here on this side.
Their sustenance and appetites, winter personalities, building ethics, the semantics of physics and the legal acts of Canadian literature. Your seminar on the arms of the octopus has an act, an intent, and an effect. Locutionary, perlocutionary, and illocutionary. What did you discover from your locutionary of your diatribe that would be a handle on the successful green, red, and amber themes of the axiom of your dissertation? Responsibility, hope, and ambition are virtues. Faults are eroded by their strength. Content makes its own message. Children are the stars of winter. They leave their footprints in the still snow. There's enough salad to feed an army of Canada's moose. My second question, what's your secret to selling so many books? The moral author. Secretary in Latin means secret. The secrets of your writing room office. What is the future, or Vivaldi was the roots of Tchaikovsky, the War of 1812. Tchaikovsky was the roots of folk music. Folk music is the roots of rock and roll. What is Canadian literature? What is the roots of Canadian literature that will be or come to be the foundations of the watchdog of 28? What are we paving for from Canadian literature in the global village?
Wow. First of all, that was beautiful. That was really smart. So I will say that your first question was about what I learned during the writing of this book. And okay, I learned that I became preoccupied at a certain point in the process of the question of what makes somebody a good person. And I think one of the things that I learned over the course of writing this book was to kind of handle that question with grace, because writing in an omniscient voice gives you a strange power, and you can see it that has all of these different characters, and they're all trying with what resources they have to do their best. And, you know, some of their behavior is considered reprehensible, some of their behavior is laudable. Sometimes the same person does both of those things within a week, or those types of behavior. So I guess I kind of learned a little bit about judgment and the nature of judgment and the need for grace in real life as well as in my writing life. And what's the secret to selling a lot of books? I would say, I don't know how many books I've sold because I'm asked not to be privy to that information, but it scares me quite a bit. But I guess I would say that being as brave as you possibly can, probably, both in terms of what you put on the page and in terms of your willingness to get up on stage and shout about it. Both of those things are scary in different ways, and they take really different muscles. And flipping between the two can be so alienating, I guess, for some people that they maybe don't do it. But I think finding that courage is necessary to selling any of your books, and you know, you've got to start with the one. And then Canadian literature is one of my favorite subjects. I absolutely love reading work by Canadian authors. It is a very big question that I don't feel equipped to answer, but in terms of my narrow purview, what I hope to see and what I'm seeing is generational progress. And I think that's what my character is hoping for, and that's what I'm hoping for, which is to say that with every new generation of Canadians, of Canadian writers, hopefully there's a little bit more freedom, a little bit more self-determination, a little bit more understanding, a little bit more respect for what you for, and the ability to create a world that's a little bit fairer.
On Camlet, do you tell me you were able to talk to Margaret Atwood about your book briefly?
Yes.
That's so cool.
Yes, I told you upstairs that she was the only person who saw the title and looked at me and said, she understood it instantly. And then like, how old are your children? Yeah.
Is there another question, Barry?
Okay, we're back.
You mentioned that you like admire Canadian writers. Are you connected with other writers?
That's such a good question, and yes, as of recently, I am beyond blessed to say that I am. That, in fact, a group of female Canadian writers who are at a similar stage of life have become very close confidants. One of them is Carly Fortune, who gave me a very generous quote. Actually, I was reading as well. There's also a guy I met Ashley first because we share the same US publisher, and we met for coffee and stayed for 3 hours. And she introduced me to Carly Fortune and to Harriet Lelai, and the four of us have now created this group where it is a weird thing to do all day. And it can feel very strange, kind of go to your desk and do like a leaf. And especially when things are happening in the world, you know? And so and you don't usually have colleagues until later when you're ready to show your work to somebody. If you're lucky, and at that stage, you'll have colleagues, maybe an editor, maybe an agent. But to have people who are doing the same thing who I can reach by text and kind of talk shop with is a huge. And then I also work regularly with a group of artists, not all of them writers, but some in a cafe nearby, and several are in attendance here this evening, which is a huge honor. So there's also that kind of daily touchpoint with other working artists who understand what it's like.
It's kind of great, actually. Okay, next question.
First of all, thank you for this book. I think as a reader, the joy that the literature brings to us is really a gift. I was quite interested in the workmanship that goes into creating the dialogue. So I understand all the themes and you did say that you could depend on your characters. I wonder what that professor, how you would depend him. But what I was really moved by was the humor that you created, comparing life in Scotland and life in Toronto. And it's probably how this one pull that together with, you know, the metaphors that you use to bring that comparison out and to create humor that you did.
Thank you, that's very kind of you to say, and a great question. I had a lot of fun with that part. I was called a snow yank regularly during my time at Edinburgh. I actually received an email recently from the young man who coined that phrase, and he says, I am not at all ashamed of having brought that excellent phrase of grumpness, and nor should you be, it's wonderful. You know, the kind of gentle ribbing that, as a kind of, it's a unique relationship, I guess, Canada's with the UK, and I'm not sure if this line even made it into the final draft, but there was a moment when I was thinking about how being Canadian there is sort of like having diplomatic immunity, because the British class system is so complicated. But everybody else, you know, they can hear from one sentence out of somebody's mouth, you know, their exact postal code and whether their grandfather went to Oxford and which college. And if not, you know, what did he do? And it's just bizarre how people can get each other's number like that, and how that can sometimes create these sort of difficult cross phrases. And as a Canadian, you just sort of sound through and sort of, you're like, hello, you've never been to my country. You've kind of been beginning to imagine whether I'm ice fishing all day or living in the city. And, you know, I found that really freeing. And I think for me, there was a lot of humor in that while I was doing it, and I enjoyed kind of playing with that on the page.
More or less freedom than an American actually.
A lot more.
Interesting.
A lot more, because Canada, I think, is more of a kind of benign black box to people than America. America has been, especially over the course of the last 100 years, so central to everybody's imagination. Whereas Canada, some people obviously know a lot about it and come to visit and recognize, but just given how large it is and how hard it is, even for a Canadian, to wrap their head around this, you know, massive, unbelievable country. It's, for so many people, maybe they've been once to Whistler, or, you know, possibly a business trip to Toronto at that one time, but to understand what it is to be Canadian is just not something that a lot of people I met abroad and grappled with. And so that gave me a lot of freedom.
How interesting you're answering that question on the day that the king was here today.
I
I think
know,
that doesn't happen, right?
that's true, that's true, what?
I think we'll take one of the last questions first.
Yes.
If there were characters in your book that could recognize themselves, that have something based on a shared memory, did you have conversations with any of those people before publishing?
It's a great question. So I guess the character who was most easily identifiable as, you know, coming to life is Alice. So I have a very close friend from Monica. And it just in terms of the biographical details, like two young women from Toronto who go to the University of Edinburgh. Anyone who's in university, obviously that's you and mine. Now, you know, minor differences in terms of affairs with professors, etc. So, you know, I don't know the way it's spoilers, but I mentioned earlier that Penn is quite kind of inward and maybe doesn't live so much in her body. Alice lives in her body quite a lot, and that wasn't true of my friend. And you know, so the liberties taken, she found hilarious, thankfully, and she has a very good sense of humor. So what I say, and she was the first person to. It took me a very, very long time to send any part of this book out into anybody's hands, and she was one of the first people, and she read the first 10 chapters on her phone the night of. She was in Francetown, she was up really late, like scrolling on her phone, and she said, you've got to keep going, you've got to go. And she instantly understood what I was trying to do, instantly embraced any parallel that might be drawn with Alice. And she's a writer too, which helps. And yeah, I guess there were also just so many witnesses. So nobody really thinks that it's, to the detail what we were doing. It's just that I guess, yeah, she has a lot of self-confidence and she's not concerned that people are gonna make that mistake.
Emma, thank you so much, and for the folks in the crowd, yes, we're going to do that. We have another here for sale, we're gonna be signing some copies, principally mine, but yes, and I think you Walker has a few words to say.
Thank you so much, Emma. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you all for being here. I would like to ask, Principal Lucia, how we make these presentations. So we have flowers for Emma and also in the bag.
And I think that's great.
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Well, as Jeff mentioned, there are books available for purchase at the back, so please take advantage of this opportunity to meet our author and meet them and have a continued conversation with you. Thank you all so very much for joining us.
And then Jeff, we're taking a group photo, can I?
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Back here, and then, we're gonna make you know. Hold it up for.
Yes.
Okay, that's. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's really good. So good interview. Oh, yeah. See.
One more good photo?
Social.
Yeah, please, give me 1 second. Three, two.
I'm ready to take consent.
Yeah. Thank you, Mother Pearl, or take you over.
That's really
hard.
Okay, great.